Welcome to the Twomey Series and tonight's presentation, Uncovering the Past, Archaeology at Sylvester Manor. I'm Steve Long, Executive Director of the East Hampton Historical Society, which is presenting the Twomey Series in collaboration with the East Hampton Library. And it's really my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Nedra Lee, whose research examines the intersection of race, class, sex, and gender in the lives of African Americans in the United States during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Initially focusing on freed Black landowners in Texas, Dr. Lee has now partnered with the Andrew Fisk Memorial Center for Archaeological Research to oversee archaeological excavations of the historic Boston Higginbotham House on Nantucket Island in Massachusetts, and at Sylvester Manor, right north of us here on Shelter Island. Dr. Lee's groundbreaking work has been supported by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the Texas Historical Commission. Prior to her move to Massachusetts, she worked for the Smithsonian Institution Libraries and the City Museum of Washington, D.C. At Sylvester Manor, and if you have not had the opportunity to visit, you must go. And I'm delighted that Donna Marie Barnes, the Director of History and Heritage at Sylvester Manor, is with us this evening. At Sylvester Manor, archaeology has been used to document how Africans, Europeans, and Native people transformed the world around them and created a complex and interconnected history that still shapes our history and our lives today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nedra Lee.
So Steve, thank you very much for the warm invitation, and thank you for the warm invitation and introduction, and thank you all for the warm welcome. It is an honor to be here. I'm very excited to talk to you today, and I'm going to talk to you about partnership today. Ordinarily, when I'm here, I like to tell. I oftentimes will give stories about the past, but today is a discussion about partnerships, and in particular about the partnership that the Fisk Center for Archaeological Research enjoys with Sylvester Manor. And this is an important partnership because when we begin to look at historic house museums or other institutions like Sylvester Manor, one of the things that oftentimes stands out about these institutions is the struggle that they face to discuss race and racism at their sites. And yet today, I'm actually going to talk to you about something positive, about the positive working relationship that we at the Fisk Center, the partnership that has arisen between Sylvester Manor, and that has been used, or the ways in which we use archaeology to illuminate Black history, and ultimately through this partnership together, how we found a means to use this archaeology to successfully grapple with a fairly dark aspect of our nation's history. Now, in the northern United States, the history of slavery and the experiences of Black people following its abolition is not widely known. And many scholars have actually argued that it's not widely known because slavery has been perceived to be short-lived and fairly benign in this region. Yet at Sylvester Manor, a historic site and nonprofit on Shelter Island, we use archaeology as a tool not just of preservation, but as research. Through the archaeological investigations at the Manor, we are working to contribute to a larger movement, not just a larger scholarly movement, but dare I say one that actually has broader socio-political implications, to document the history and presence of Black and Native people in this state. The Manor aims to counter the historical invisibility of Black and Native people by preserving and protecting landmarks like the Afro-Indigenous burial ground, which is the resting place to the people of color who worked at the Manor, and that also stands as a testament to their lives there. These actions challenge the misconception that slavery played a brief role in the state's history, but most importantly, they physically inscribe this history on the landscape. So this talk ultimately is presenting a different side of archaeology, one that shows the field in particular as focusing on a more recent past, not one that is in a distant or a past that's focusing on looking at more ancient or exotic sort of sites and histories. So I aim to give you all a different look, or at least a different perspective of archaeology, one that's focusing more on the recent past, not one that's looking at a deep or distant past, not one that is actually in Egypt, but one that is right here, right in what many would argue is our backyard. I also perhaps want to introduce you to an archaeology that has a social mission, but I also want to introduce you to or show you that partnerships like the one between Sylvester Manor and the Fifth Center aren't new or unconventional in the state of New York, but rather underutilized. And that engaging in such partnerships can yield unknown information about historic properties such as Sylvester Manor, but can also be important because they shed light on the lives and experiences of people from underrepresented communities who once lived, labored, loved, and labored, and loved there. So for those of you who have not been to Sylvester Manor, let's take a walk. So we're going to Shelter Island via my graduate students, but still in this picture. So Sylvester Manor, as I mentioned before, is a nonprofit and educational farm located on Shelter Island on the eastern end of Long Island. The site preserves and tells the history of the Sylvester family, who resided here from 1652 to 2014. Now, while the manor once encompassed all of Shelter Island, and I want you to imagine roughly 8,000 acres ultimately being the site of this. The grounds as we currently know it now comprises 250 acres of land that includes more than 60 acres of preserved pasturage for livestock, 7 acres of actively cultivated farmland for the growing of fruits and vegetables, 2 historic cemeteries, an 18th century Georgian manor house, and several cottages and farm outbuildings. There's also a restored 19th century windmill. Now, each of these structures traces the manor's history from its settlement and establishment as a provisioning plantation beginning in 1652 by Nathaniel Sylvester, who was an English merchant who once was born and raised in Amsterdam, and later its use as a small-scale farmstead and homestead by his descendants. The manor has been continuously owned and occupied for almost 11 generations of the Sylvester family. And so all of the historic architecture that I just described in the landscape is a testament to the Sylvester family's personal accomplishments and their contributions to the development of Shelter Island. In 2015, the manor was designated as a historic district and was added to the United States National Register of Historic Places. And when we begin to think about it being added to the National Register, some of the individuals of the Sylvester family that we see the site ultimately celebrating or acknowledging are people such as Nicol Havens Daring. This was actually one of the great-grandchildren of the son of Nathaniel Sylvester. Eben Horsford, who was born in 1818, was a Harvard professor and chemist. He was not a direct descendant of the Sylvesters, but actually married into the family. And we most know him for his reformulation and sort of creation of baking powder. I am actually going to probably not do a good job pronouncing Mary Lumdu's name, so please help me out if I did not say it correctly. So she's born in 1824 to Samuel Smith Gardner. Now, she is a direct Sylvester descendant. She was also a poet who published in well-known periodicals like the Knickerbocker and the Gaudi's Ladies Book. And then we also have Cornelia Horsford, who is an individual is quite important. And we'll talk more about Cornelia Horsford when we begin to look at look in particular at the Afro-Indigenous burial ground on the property. But she's born in 1861. She's the daughter of Eben Horsford Phoebe Dayton Gardner, and she's actually believed to have erected the stone monument that commemorates where the people of color who ultimately lived and worked at Sylvester Manor, where they're buried. So when we talk about 11 generations living at Sylvester Manor, and when and about them sort of about the need to commemorate what they did in their lives there, these are just some of the individuals that we are ultimately pointing out and speaking to. Now, the archaeology has long been a vital part of not just, when I say the sort of mission to preserve the property, but also to ultimately uncover information about this property. And one of the things that I want to point out to you all is archaeologists at UMass Boston have conducted excavations at Sylvester Manor for almost 2 decades. In fact, archaeological excavations have been carried out by faculty, staff, and graduate students that are affiliated with the Fisk Center for Archaeological Research. This has all been done under the direction of my colleague, Dr. Stephen Mrzowski. We oftentimes affectionately call him Dr. Steve, but he is the one who actually began studying Sylvester Manor in 1998. And when we talk about studying Sylvester Manor, he's the one in the beginning who ultimately started to look for, or the goal was to understand the layout of the 17th century of the property, and in particular, the locations of the provisioning plantation that was started. And just to go back, one of the things that I want to point out, I mentioned to you all, in particular, that the manor was first settled by Nathaniel and Grizel Sylvester. Grizel was his wife in 1652. They arrived from Barbados with the purpose of establishing a provisioning plantation to provide foodstuff and other raw goods to support 2 sugar plantations in Barbados. And so when I talk about the presence today of an 18th century Georgian mansion, that what you see in the back, the archaeology in particular first was done with the sole purpose of trying to actually answer questions about where was this sort of early home where Nathaniel Sylvester actually lived? Where would have been some of the outbuildings that were associated with the provisioning, with the provisioning plantation? Could we actually even, and this is one of our sort of continued longstanding, perhaps unanswered questions, but can we even get an idea of what a provisioning plantation looks like? And this is actually a really important question, because when we think about plantations, we don't associate plantations with actually the northern United States. We totally think about that as being a type of agricultural operation that we see primarily in the southern United States, and really sort of the landscape in New York as being one dotted with smaller farms, largely sort of fueling and feeding a more local market. And so this right here, when we think about Sylvester Manor, really changes and in some ways really speaks to the importance of sites like this, because it opens up a totally new understanding of how we begin to think about this particular region, the role that it played not only in the sort of in the rise of the United States, but also thinking about the role that it played perhaps in connecting New York, the North, with a larger sort of capitalist economy that rested on plantation-based labor. And so trying to ask questions about the history and the layout of the property was really the goal of many of these early excavations. In addition to that, what I would say is that over the 2 decades, the questions have changed. Not changed, because we still have many of the same questions, but they've evolved in some ways. And part of the evolution of those questions has everything to do with the ways in which, as we begin to look for the sort of the homestead and at least begin to try to map out the boundaries of the provisioning plantation, we begin to start finding material that spoke to the types of labor that the individuals, and when I say the individuals, not just the Europeans such as Nathaniel and Grizel and their children who lived here, or many of the indentured servants that they brought here, but also in particular the indigenous people that lived there and later that were indentured to work there. And also the number of enslaved Black people who also were brought to Shelter Island to work this property. So labor has become an important question, and the excavations have ultimately shed light on that topic. And it's also importantly, in many ways, shed light on the multicultural interactions between Europeans, Native Americans, and people of African descent. And I really want to emphasize the multicultural interactions because it really forces us to think not in sort of such compartmentalized ways about the ways in which people would have interacted, but to think about flows, about a much more dynamic relationship that would have taken place, yes, under some very challenging conditions, and some would argue exploitative conditions, but still one that was more of a dynamic process of that was ultimately fostered between labor and cultural exchange. This is just giving you an indication of how extensive the archaeology has, and I don't even think this is actually, this doesn't even give you a complete look at how extensive the archaeology has been. So in particular, what you're going to see is you'll see, I have a map of what we call the South and Southeast Lawn. So this is literally just the area right directly in front of the current manor house. And this is actually a picture of probably every shovel test and every test unit that we, and some of the excavation units as well, that we have ultimately, that we placed on this property beginning in 1998. And also probably a few years afterwards, but most of these were sort of done within the first decade of the project. I also want to point out, so I've spoken to, in many ways, I've just spoke to you about the importance of the archaeology as a source of recovering information. But I have to also, I cannot neglect the fact that the archaeology is also an ongoing tool when we think about the location, not just the protecting and preserving of historic resources above ground, but also below ground, because this is still an active site. It's still being used for educational purposes. And so we still actually, archaeology is still used to locate places that have not been so thoroughly excavated. And so right here, this is actually one of my favorite pictures because it's actually a picture from 2024 of the recent excavations that took place in the basement of the manor house. And this was actually done, this was work that was done to ensure that an elevator is going to be put in to make sure that the manor is ADA compliant. But one of the really amazing things about this work was that we were once again looking for that earliest 17th century ground surface, and we think we stumbled across it right in the basement. So this is one of my favorite pictures. And you can see here members of the history and heritage team looking at us as we are in a very tight space, as you can see. Not one that's very well lit. We had to stand on a stool to actually step into the basement. But it was actually really exciting finds. So what has more than 2+ decades of research gotten us? So one of the things I actually just want to point out is that we've recovered roughly 300,000 plus artifacts. If I had to give you a rough account as of today, my graduate students have reported that we actually are probably at 360,000 roughly. If you look at, they are probably in about 280 boxes. And most of if you look at at least the breakdown of the pie chart, you can see that most of the collection comprises architectural material and faunal material. Ceramics are a big part as well. We have 23,000 plus ceramics that literally span almost probably 3-4 centuries of the occupation of the Sylvesters, glass, and close to 5,000 smoking pipes. Okay? And so one of the things I like to point out when you look at the breakdown of the artifacts is, again, we talk about labor, but it is a really interesting snapshot of everyday life at Sylvester Manor. When we want to get a closer look at some of the artifacts, we can see an indication. So here are some of the bricks that represent that architectural material. We can see some of the ceramics. We have actually ceramics pictured right to the left of me and also right here at the bottom. And then we also have a stone tool. Now, one of the things that I should point out when we think about the multicultural interactions, however, is that each one of these artifacts represents that dynamic interaction between Europeans, Native Americans, and people of African descent. And this is in particular best pointed out by this pot right down here. This is a pot that would have been made out of local clays, largely sort of made in the style of European pottery, but manufactured using the sort of processes that are known to Native Americans. And so we look at this pot and we think about this pot being used by by enslaved Africans or enslaved people. And we think about this pot literally as a symbol of the types of interactions, the meldings that would have taken place all through labor and everyday life here at Sylvester Manor. And this is the part where I have to sort of really point out that much of that when we think about an artifact such as this, we really begin to see the ways in which the history or the historical and the archaeological research at the manor has a special ability to shed light on Black history, and in particular, not just Black history, but the protracted Black history right here on Long Island. In a previous slide, I noted that the website of Sylvester Manor considers the property the most intact remnant of a former slaveholding plantation north of Virginia. And so this means that when we think about oftentimes the gaps in historical documents that speak to those interactions, that documents at times can be quite silent in telling us about the sort of intimate ways in which those interactions would have taken place. The archaeology in some ways gives us that. And the archaeology becomes plays an important role in bridging the gap between not only the structures that are remaining on the manor's landscape or the robust archive that the Sylvesters left behind, but it becomes a bridge between all of those sources to illuminate the lives and experiences of the Black and Native American people who occupied this property. It also is very clear on the point that slavery existed on Long Island alongside the exploitation and indenture of Native Americans for labor. And thus, the ceramics and lithic artifacts become a testament to how processes like colonialism, capitalism, and racism ultimately brought these two groups together and created opportunities for the development of community. In one of my favorite quotes by archaeologists Steve Mrzowski, Catherine Hayes, and Anne Hancock, and these are all people who have worked on this site. I mentioned Steve Mrzowski as the project director, but Catherine Hayes was a former graduate student who worked here and also wrote a book later about the excavations that took place here. But in 2007, in an article, they wrote, and I quote, that the Sylvester Manor project has sought to investigate the material and spatial expressions of this encounter between these three groups, with an eye towards understanding the transformational processes that shaped it. And I love this quote because the word encounters here really references the sort of quotidian or daily encounters, the daily encounters that got forged through the use of ceramics, the building of property, the taking down of buildings, the sort of use of stone tools. But it really speaks to the daily encounters in ways in which the lives and labors of these two groups would have ultimately taken place, where they would have shared space, but most importantly, negotiated their entwined futures. Now, to get a little bit more specific about what this also says to us, and I mentioned in the beginning of this talk that one of the biggest goals that we've ultimately attempted to achieve in our work together has not been not just to challenge this misconception that slavery was short-lived or benign in the North, but also to begin to try to sort of help us understand the nature of it. And in some ways, this is me making a plea for us to not always sort of get stuck in this need to compare to the South, but to perhaps to spend some time looking at the particularities of this strange institution that we call slavery right here in this region. And one of the things that has come out when we begin to look at the Sylvesters is that we see that slavery on Long Island was not just characterized by the sort of its existence or the enslavement of indigenous people right alongside people of African descent, but that it was also shaped by prominent settlers like the Sylvesters coming to the island with their slaves, oftentimes from the West Indies, that they came to New England from the Caribbean en masse, that they settled in eastern Long Island and enjoyed quite a bit of political and economic leeway, enough that allowed for them to even designate their properties as manors, and and so the manor actually fits that particular pattern. One of the things that stands out about this is that when we think about Sylvester Manor, we also see that it actually exceeds the number that Long Island had some of the largest numbers of enslaved people in the region. And that when we think about some of the averages of people who held enslaved people in the region, it was not 2 or 3 people, but instead the Sylvester Manor, we see at its earliest, there were 24 enslaved individuals. Now, over the years, some of the descendants declined and decreased that number, but it's always more than the average. I think following the sort of initial 24 that were brought in 1652, we see some of the family members holding as many as 6 and 7, and then again, that number increasing to 10. And so this was always a really critical part, or at least some form of exploited labor has always been a critical part of the sort of operation and success of the agricultural enterprise that took place here. So, I mentioned community. I mentioned interactions. And so our work today, and I mentioned the ways in which this work has evolved, now begins to sort of try to put a name or more of a name to some of the individuals who once lived in labor here. Remembering that these are individuals who, as I said, who lived here, but also loved here, who didn't just work there, but loved, had lives and aspirations on their own. And so much of the subsequent archaeological research, and this is where I would argue where I've come in, because I'm actually one of the newest members of the project team, has actually begun to try to tie some of our earliest studies of the 17th and 18th century towards beginning to look at 19th century life at the manor. And in particular, we've tried to actually understand the lives of individuals like Julia Havens Johnson and David Hempstead, and also the lives of two Montauk brothers, known most for actually leaving sort of etchings on the attic walls at the manor, but in particular, who were indentured to Samuel Smith Gardner by their mother at the ages of 8 and 5, and who one later leaves to go participate in whaling voyages. And one of the ways in which we have ultimately attempted to give the individuals who live there, to begin to personalize their stories, to begin to make them more known, is through the study and through the survey of the African indigenous burial ground. So this past summer in 2005, we were at the manor and we conducted a ground-penetrating radar survey that was aimed at identifying the boundaries of this cemetery. So this survey is aimed at not only helping the manor to continue to protect this property, but like I said, it's also to try to begin to really personalize these histories even more. This survey was led by Dr. John Steinberg, who is a research scientist in the Fisk Archaeological Research Center, and it also included an analysis of the Sylvester Family Cemetery, which is also near the Quaker meeting grounds. I should add that ground-penetrating radar is actually used, it's a remote sensing technique, so it's non-invasive, and it allows us to identify burials in the absence of excavation, so no actual digging in this case. So these are some of the graduate students that are just pictured with the GPR. So you can see here that in contrast to the sort of nearby cemetery near the Quaker grounds, this one does not have tombstones. Instead, as you can see, there are field stones. So there are about 100 field stones that were visible on the surface. And our work involved, not in addition to using the GPR, but trying to flag and identify each one of these field stones with the hope of trying to determine whether or not they were marking actual burials. So oral testimony sort of suggests that there were 200 burials, in conjunction with the research that was done by Donna Marie Barnes and Alice Clark from the History and Heritage team, in conjunction with our own archaeological findings. We've confirmed about 70, okay? And one of the questions that we find ourselves really grappling with, so in 1884, Both Eben Horsford and his daughter Cornelia actually erected a stone. They placed a large boulder right at the edge of the cemetery that at least notes that this was where the sort of the burial ground was for the people of color here. And one of the things that we kept trying to sort of understand is, okay, this is, this is the only sort of like marker. Are there any other physical items on the ground that will ultimately shed light on who was interred here? The members of the History and Heritage team to help answer that question. They went to Southold. They also came here, right here, to this particular archive. But they looked at records from the Presbyterian Church, all in an effort to begin to identify some of the names of these individuals. And one of the things that I want to point out is right here, and it may be hard for you to see on the slide, but in the letter, is that in this diary entry, diary entry, Cornelia mentions that much of the cemetery was covered by brush, but that they were looking at the depressions in the ground, as a way, and various depressions in the ground to ultimately sort of trace where many of the people were, where they may have been potentially interred. And one of the questions that we've ultimately been trying to answer with the archaeology is, how do we ultimately reconcile what Cornelia writes in her diary entry with what we're ultimately seeing today with the burial ground? What's accounting for some of the differences in terms of how it may have looked? We've also joined the History and Heritage team in looking at the correspondence of also women of Esther Sarah Havens in an effort to answer these questions. I'll just quickly point out, we used our survey of the Sylvester Family Cemetery near the Quaker grounds was just to try to give us an idea, potentially, of any possible similarities. This is actually a clipping at the bottom from the 1884 newspaper that described the commemoration of this particular cemetery, that also acknowledged the Sylvester sort of as, as providing sort of refuge for early Quakers, also describing their sort of early arrival. And so one of the things that we found, so we have some markers right here at this particular cemetery, the one big one, tabletop one right in the middle. But what we found was, in contrast with to the Afro-Indigenous Burial Ground Cemetery, we had 7 interments that we were able to identify with strong confidence. 5 burials that do not have associated markers. Now, why this is important? Because it actually suggests that there were some markers that ultimately got removed and would have been intentionally placed there to commemorate this property. And so this is just one more of the kind of types of broader landscape changes that the archaeology has been paying attention to and trying to trace. Also, in our efforts to understand the lives, like David Hempstead and Julia Havens, has been returning to this sort of core grounds. And in particular, we have taken an 1828 map that was produced during a dispute between Samuel Gardner and Esther Sarah Daring. And in particular, we have returned to the dairy. So this is actually a site that was first excavated in 1993 and 1996. One of the things that's interesting about the dairy is that this is perhaps the one area of the site where we have the largest amount of 19th century artifacts in particular. So it's actually giving us when we talk about sort of a recent look at what life would have looked like for people at Sylvester Manor. This is us beginning to reopen that unit, and here's something exciting. So one of the highlights of when you go to visit the property is that there is a cobble walkway that is at the outside in the front of the house that was actually placed there in the 17th century by the Sylvesters early on. It would have been used to probably keep the work area clean. And we also found another cobble surface that would have been near the dairy. So this is just a kind of overview in particular of some of what the archaeology has been able to what it's found, what it's accomplished. And I guess I opened up by saying that I wanted to say to you or speak to you about the success of partnership. So one of the things that I can point out to you that I think is a really critical part that speaks to this relationship between history and archaeology is, first, that this project has seen the publication of 2 books, One in particular that many of you all may be very familiar with is Matt Griswold's The Manor, 3 Centuries at a Slave Plantation on Long Island, published in 2013, and Catherine Howlett Hayes' Slavery Before Race, Europeans, and Indians at Sylvester Manor Plantation. It has also yielded several peer-reviewed articles, in particular, one that was published in the in the Journal of Historical Sociology, a special volume that was in the Journal of Northeastern Archaeology and Archaeological Dialogues. There has also been 1 dissertation and 10 master's theses. And recently we received financial support from the Mellon Foundation to go back to both catalog and re-inventory all of the artifacts that have come from the roughly 2+ decades of excavations that we've done. It supported the recent surveys of the Afro-Indigenous burial ground, and also the work that we're doing at the dairy, and in particular, a reanalysis of this material culture, of which some of the research that I've mentioned here is a product of. Sites like Sylvester Manor, and also when you begin to think about this within a broader sort of state context, like the African burial ground in Manhattan, have been absolutely vital to illuminating the nature of slavery here, right here in the North, dispelling the claims that slavery was short-lived or benign. But it also joins the research of archaeologists like Christopher Matthews, conducted in Setauket, with the Bethel Christian Avenue and Laurel Hill Historic District that tries to expand or broaden narratives beyond slavery to look at the sort of forming of vital, strong communities of Black and Native American people in Long Island. I should mention that Sylvester Manor is a site of conscience. And what this means is that it is a place of memory that preserves and tells the history of difficult, often past events. So part of a larger network of 400 historic sites, museums, and memorials in 80 countries, Sites of Conscience work to counter the erasure of the past and to foster dialogue and civic action. In an article describing these sites, Linda Norris, in her article, What Does It Mean to Be a Site of Conscience? Good Trouble Across the Globe, she states that the central tenet of these sites of conscience is that history has the power to create positive change. The International Coalition of Sites of Conscience argues that these sites recognize that the power of sites of memory is not inherent. It must be harnessed as a deliberate tactic, like we harness archaeology, in the service of human rights and civic engagement. So as historians, as archaeologists, as educators, as historic preservers, we are all called to harness our work for the good for our communities. And we can do this through such partnerships. And thank you. We'll open the floor up to questions.
Probably about 10 or 15 minutes of
Okay.
questions.
All right. Yes.
How did the Emancipation Proclamation immediately affect the manor, if at all?
Good question. So I was asked, how did the Emancipation Proclamation impact the manor, if at all? And so, one of the things that I think I should point out is that slavery is actually abolished. It's gradually abolished right here in New York in 1827. And so I think probably the biggest impact would have been is that individuals who would have ultimately been enjoying some level of freedom ultimately got to see the nationwide abolition of slavery for their kin who may have been in the South. And when I say kin, I'm sort of speaking not just in terms of bloodline, but individuals who would have at some point shared a common condition with them in terms of either how they were racialized or at least in terms of this sort of experience of enslavement. The one thing I will point out is that the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't necessarily sort of mean that people were able to enjoy the full rights of citizenship. We know that in 1863 they're still fighting the Civil War, that there are even many people of African descent in this region who are going off to actually fight. But I think the biggest point that I like to sometimes point out is when we think about the relationship of people in the North, as we see a continued battle for freedom happening outside of that region, is that people would have felt some kind of common cause and the need for an end to slavery, that there was a common cause for everyone to enjoy the rights of freedom. Yes.
Do studies go on year-round at the manor, and where do they stay?
Good question. So you asked, do studies go on year-round at the manor, and where do we stay? So I should actually have Donna Marie answer that question. Before she answers that, what I would say is we primarily work in the summer. And then I'll turn it over to Donna Marie.
I'll stand up.
Can you speak into the microphone?
I'll bring you the mic.
Sorry.
Really?
Yeah. It's for the recording.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I'll stand right here. So we do work all year round. The manor is not open to the public during the winter, but we continue our research. I chuckled because at the moment we have a broken furnace, and so we have no heat or water, and the part will take 6 weeks to get there. You know the story. But yes, our research does continue year-round. We do a lot of it online. We come to the library. We visit various archives in the region, nationally and internationally. Okay.
Thank you. And I would say the work that we do year-round happens in the lab. Our field work happens primarily in the summer and in the spring, but mostly in the summer. And we've stayed right on Shelter Island when we've done that field work. Yes.
Are you able to ascertain where the artifacts came from? Because a lot of those pieces, like the china, look like it's probably from Europe.
Good question. So I was asked, are we able to ascertain where some of the artifacts come from? Great question. So in some cases, and that is actually, so let me say that is when you think of some of the work that our graduate students are doing, that is actually one of the main questions, especially for the graduate students who are studying ceramics and in particular the smoking pipes. Most of that work is aimed at trying to trace where those items would have come from. And that's really important because it's giving us an idea of trade, of not just early trade networks, but also the types of economic relationships that the Sylvesters would have been forged, or that they were forging. Now, one of the things that has come up in some of our studies of the ceramics and the brick, and I say this, I'm getting ready to laugh about the brick because one of the questions that everyone has asked for 20 plus years is, are these Dutch bricks? So, you know, there's a thing that we usually, that we associate the yellow bricks with being from Amsterdam, and that more reddish bricks are kind of styled within kind of a, you know, sort of British, you know, kind of means. And we've gone back and forth about this. And in the beginning, some of this was really geared towards trying to think about when the Sylvesters are first arriving here, exactly what identity do we see them ultimately most fashioning with this? And over the years, this question has changed because even as we look at the bricks, and in particular, we say we have so many yellow bricks, these are Dutch bricks. Most of the ceramics that we found have actually were imported from Britain. The same with our pipes. And so that has really changed not just how we think about where these artifacts are coming from, but also changed how we think about the Sylvesters would have been expressing who they were as they found themselves almost in a fairly kind of, for them, probably a frontier setting. We like to think of them now as being quite cosmopolitan. The students and I talk about them extensively as being not just as merchants, but reminding each other that these would have been individuals that found themselves in Shelter Island via Barbados, and then before Barbados, Amsterdam, so that they're quite cosmopolitan. They're quite used to a really a broad market that they would have ultimately had more than enough access to choose from in terms of how they styled themselves. So that's a great question, and it's actually one of the key questions I think that we try to answer when after we've gone through the work of identifying what an artifact is. It's the one thing that begins to help us talk about questions about identity, or even in terms of talking about economic status. Yes.
Have you found Kelowna ware at Sag Harbor or in Sylvester Manor? Because we found it here in East Hampton, and I was curious about that because it's not supposed to be common to the northern states.
Okay, that's another great question. So I was asked, have we found Kelowna ware? And this is a particular type of, do you want to explain what it is?
You do a better
So
job.
this is actually, so I'm going to show you all. So my first answer as I'm answering his question is, I would argue yes, that we have. So Kelowna ware is a low fire, so it's a ceramic that's fired at a very low temperature, so it's fairly coarse in comparison to your more sort of refined earthenware pictured to the left. And one of the reasons why it's actually a really important ceramic is that it is argued to be a ceramic that specifically represents the interactions between indigenous and people of African descent. So it's a ware that is specifically created through their exchange of cultural information as they're laboring and also sharing information about environment or sort of, kind of manufacturing techniques. Now, previously, archaeologists used to be one of the main artifacts that archaeologists would turn to when attempting to identify where enslaved people lived, and also when they were talking about enslaved Africans or enslaved Black people's, sort of cultural patterns that they were ultimately keeping and passing down here. But it also led to a big debate because this particular ware is oftentimes manufactured, it's styled after European ceramic vessels, and it oftentimes, and the sort of the sort of fabric or kind of the material that it's made out of, oftentimes it differs, right? And people have sometimes argued that if you find it primarily in Virginia or in the Carolinas, that it reflects more of an African style. And if it has, a symbol on the bottom of it, it's definitely produced by Africans. If it doesn't have that, or if it may not have a particular kind of sort of like decorative aspect, that it's more in Native American made. And so we've gone back and forth, and now we just like to think of it as really representing that sort of multicultural, sort of interaction. Now, you're absolutely right. Typically, it's not expected to be found in northern sites. Sometimes you don't even find it. Most of the sites that it's actually been found primarily in the South have been Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, oftentimes our oldest kind of colonial, dated sites. So we actually argue that we do have Kelowna ware. And this is one of the reasons, again, why Sylvester Manor is such an important site when we begin to think about not just slavery and like in general, right? Slavery as it's emerging right in the United States, but also slavery as we begin to think about the ways in which places like the Manor, how it perhaps befuddles comparisons to Southern places, or how it may actually really invite that. Some have actually argued that maybe we should not even use the term Kelowna ware to actually describe this, because this Kelowna ware is in some ways is not just made or not just determined according to the sort of fabric or sort of the material that makes up a ceramic, but also has to be a decision that's determined according to the style of the vessel. And that if we don't consider that, then we have to actually consider that some of these vessels would have also just been produced by Native peoples who would have been here even before, like the Sylvesters and their enslaved laborers came. And so some have actually have argued that we should just think about it as also just a type of early ceramic left and made by Native peoples. But we still call it colonial-aware. If you look at how we catalog it, it's actually currently cataloged as colonial-aware. Maybe that would be a thesis? No? Yes.
Yeah, it's kind of a related question. You mentioned the two native boys who were in the attic. And so I was wondering about discovery of the housing of the enslaved peoples, and if the natives and those of African descent were together, or these were in the attic and these were off, and so how their cultures blended other than in the fields and, you know.
So you asked me about where people lived, where enslaved and native people lived, and I'll answer that. And so they actually live together. They are living together. And you even describe the places where they're living. They're living together in the attics of the houses. They're oftentimes in garrets or sort of small hallways. We even would argue that they're likely even in the outbuildings together. This is one of the reasons why the dairy has become such a fascinating place to work, because it will likely may even be another place where we think people would have lived. This is a question that we get all the time. And it's actually a question that my colleague and I, for this past field season, we actually had a bet, because one of the arguments that he felt was that maybe we should be thinking about a model from Barbados in terms of Sylvester Manor, the early sort of property being laid out according to a Barbadian model. And so one of the things we're trying to ask is, well, what would that look like? And he argued it looks like there being separate quarters. And I thought, no, I don't think so. You know, I think that literally that they're living together. And that's been pretty much confirmed in the historical research that the History and Heritage team has done. You see references also in sort of probates and other sort of inventories that sort of suggest that. You see it in terms of even the sort of architecture and layout of the house. And it's a pattern that actually has been established through other archaeological excavations. And that's one of the things I think that also makes this such a very interesting, you know, sort of characteristic to begin to think about how power, you know, sort of works, because there's an intimacy, right, that it's actually sort of operating through when you think about the sort of ways in which they're living. Donna Marie, do you want to add anything?
No, you're good.
Oh, okay. All right, so,
Last question.
oh, I don't,
And
okay.
then afterwards, you'll have to speak to the speaker.
Okay, I'll go all the way in the back. Yes.
Who were the Sylvesters trading with? Did they have a plantation in Barbados as well? And were they trading people back and forth as well as foodstuffs?
Okay, great question. Great question. And
But she's gonna have me answer.
yes, and I'll jump in, but don't
Okay.
forget to say the question.
Repeat the question.
Yes,
Okay.
repeat the question.
Actually, can you repeat that question again? You wanted to know who the Sylvesters were trading with?
Yes, did they have?
And did they have a plantation in Barbados?
Or
Yes.
were they trading with other
Yes.
related plants?
So the purpose of the settlement of Shelter Island was specifically to provision the plantation that the Sylvesters owned in Barbados. It's called the Constant Plantation. It still exists. They still grow sugarcane. It's not associated with the Sylvester family, although like Sylvester Manor, it descended through the descendants of Constance Sylvester up until 1914, when it was then sold to another family. Nathaniel Sylvester and his brother Constant had two other partners, Thomas Middleton and Thomas Roush, who also had plantations in Barbados. So the place in Shelter Island was for two reasons. One was for a political refuge, because it was during the English Civil War. The Sylvesters and their partners were parliamentarians and supporters of Oliver Cromwell versus the Royalists. And so this English Civil War was also being perpetrated in the Caribbean, and they needed a safe haven in case that they were sent into exile, which they were. They also needed a place where they could grow food, raise livestock, and harvest raw materials to then be shipped to their plantations in Barbados, because They didn't grow food, they didn't raise livestock, and they had already cut down all of the raw material in an effort to grow sugarcane, which was making them unbelievably rich. So it was actually a very forward-thinking kind of economic structure that they came up with, and it has been argued recently that the model of Sylvester Manor as a provisioning place was then replicated in other places in New England and throughout the Caribbean.
Yeah. And what does this look like archaeologically? Because that is actually the next question to once you hear that. So far, what this has looked like archaeologically has been a slaughter pit. We found, like I said, I mentioned to you that the animal remains are one of the most numerous types of artifacts that we found at the manor. And in particular, we have a slaughter pit that probably has the equivalent of almost 13 or 14, would have had total, but both large pigs and cows that would have been slaughtered and likely salted and later sort of like barreled and sent to the West Indies. What has been interesting is what we think actually marks a shift in their provisioning at some point is that we start seeing small declines in some of the other pits, or small declines in that number of total animal bones that we've actually sort of discovered. And we think some of that may be tied towards, sort of the descendants of Nathaniel Sylvester beginning to start to sort of like farm at a smaller but perhaps local more like level, that they're beginning to really kind of trade on a local level. And we see this in particular with the dairy products. We also have seen this with the large numbers of sheep, and also with the dairies actually beginning to take care of the sheep to actually process wool and to actually turn it into cloth. And so that's been our way to try to also, in addition to looking at trade at a broader, sort of like global level, but also thinking about the ways in which they're taking advantage of emerging markets right here, and at least linking the archaeology towards what has been found in the documents. Okay, I think I have to, so thank you all for your questions. Thank you.